Holy shit, this game is awesome.
I see the mistake in the force.
Holy shit, this game sucks.
Far Cry 5 is basically a big playground. You can go anywhere, do anything, whatever you want, however you want. But sometimes playgrounds don't have much to offer. Go down the slide, monkey bar, swing set, rinse, repeat. And I don't really understand why it's getting such high scores. I mean, yeah, it's fun, but it can also be really boring. And you laugh just as much from the ludicrous, over-the-top stuff you can do as you do when the game is broken, or breaking right in front of you. The game starts on a good note. You're a rookie cop sent in to serve an arrest warrant to Joseph Seed, the leader of Eden's Gate, a radical religious cult oppressing the people of Hope County. Seed comes off as a compelling villain. He obviously exerts total control over his followers, who seem willing to die in order to please him. Of course, things go horribly wrong and Seed escapes capture, leaving you for dead. The rest of the game is about liberating the rebels from Seed's oppression and taking back Hope County. What you do next is really up to you. You can choose which of the 3 areas you want to start liberating first, or you can mix it up and move from one to the other. Everything you do will reward you resistance points, and once you obtain enough, you can face off against the sibling that controls the region. Eliminating all 3 means confronting Joseph once and for all. The first impression of gameplay is good. You have a lot of freedom in approaching combat as well as moving around the world. The staple of the Far Cry series has always been liberating outposts, and the game works really well during these sequences. Of course, it's always fun to blast through everyone berserker style, but there's actually a lot more stealth to the game than you might think. Not only using silenced weapons and takedowns, but the crossbow became my favorite weapon for its ability to take out targets from range. You also have to disable alarms, otherwise reinforcements will be called in. But despite this, enemies become aware of your presence a little too easily sometimes, which can make stealth playthroughs frustrating. Another thing the game does well is the companion system. Certain missions you complete will reward you with an NPC that can be added to your roster. Not only humans, but animals as well. From a loyal dog named Boomer to a mammoth black bear named Cheeseburger, these companions will respond to your commands, aid you in combat, and also revive you if you run out of health. Companions are diverse too. Some are better for stealth, some will provide air support, and of course there's the RPG-wielding Herc who will destroy any and all vehicles that you need him to. Now, one thing that's undeniable is the majesty of Hope County. I've never been to Montana, but this looks about as real as I would suspect it to be. There's some incredible attention to detail. The forests, lakes, rivers, and plains are all a joy to behold. The dynamic day-night effects, as well as the colorful skybox, all add this great feel of immersion. And on top of it all, there's dynamic fauna throughout, so you might be going through a wooded area and run into some deer, or a grizzly bear, or climbing a mountain and run into some eagles, or see some wild boar crossing a plain, something like that. It really makes you feel that this world is alive. Now, the pop-in is about as bad as it could be, but I give Ubisoft a pass because when you factor in the sheer size of the world and all of the intricate textures that comprise it, it would seem extremely difficult to avoid. Plus, it doesn't take too much away from the experience, so I would say it's negligible. But with that said, the immense scope of the environment does take away from immersion a bit because I often found myself in the middle of nowhere with no vehicles spawned anywhere near me. The earlier parts of the game are the worst because you haven't discovered enough locations yet to fast travel, but even as I was completing the game, I still found that there was a ton of locations that I couldn't get to without access to a plane or helicopter. The terrain can also be difficult to navigate without access to these vehicles or the grappling perk, as you'll often have to scale mountains without being able to do so, and you keep sliding down in frustration. Now, speaking of vehicles, cars, four-wheelers, trucks, boats, planes, helicopters are all at your disposal, adding to this playground-like feel. The problem here is that certain vehicles handle poorly, especially at first when you aren't used to it. The first-person perspective makes it a bit awkward, especially in 2-passenger vehicles, because you can't always tell when you're about to hit something. Some cars and boats handle a bit like yachts, not immediately responding to your controls, and I thought shooting from vehicles was extremely awkward, and for the most part it didn't work for me, not only because aiming isn't precise, but also I found it difficult to control the vehicle and shoot at the same time. The control scheme was a bit counterintuitive. Surprisingly, shooting the guns from a plane or helicopter was imprecise for me as well. I'd have a target dead in my sights, fire away, and they wouldn't die, like at all. Now, there are other ways to get around. I alluded to grappling earlier, and I found this mechanic cool, especially when infiltrating outposts, as it opens up new possibilities and ways to take out enemies. You're going to want to invest in the grappling perk when you have to climb mountains and hills, as it's usually the only way to make it unless you have an aerial vehicle like I said before. You can also get a wingsuit, allowing you to soar through the air and reach other areas of the map quicker than running or driving. And ziplining is a cool feature, again, useful when dealing with outposts. So I'm mentioning perks quite a bit, and I can't help but feel the progression system was tacked on, or at the very least, not explored as in-depth as maybe it could have been. Unlike most games where you progress by experience points, instead you obtain perks by completing challenges that are preset, like getting a certain number of kills with specific weapons, or hunting down a specific animal, or catching a specific fish, or you can just find books lying around the world, mostly concentrated in prepper stashes, which act as little side quests. The perk tree is pretty rudimentary, as the perks are tiered off, but I honestly felt like the system was pointless. Aside from the things I've talked about like grappling and the wingsuit, I never felt starved for skill points, like at all. I found quickly that getting skills didn't do much to help me finish the game. The combat perks are kind of a joke, as they help you reload faster and supposedly reduce recoil and sway, although I never noticed this at all during combat. The only really helpful perks are ones that increase your inventory, so you can carry more weapons and items to craft with. The rest of the perks are really all about speeding up the game. You can swim faster, move quicker when crouched, reload faster like I said before, and your companions come back from injury faster. It all just feels kind of shallow and forced in without much effort. Something else that feels forced is the story. At the beginning I talked about the strong opening. You're thrown into this world where fanatical cultists are ruling the land, and you have to fight with the resistance against the Seed family in this vast open world setting. Unfortunately, the story suffers from a lack of focus, quantity over quality, and the simple fact that there's just way too much for you to do, that it's really hard to get invested in the narrative or the characters. I mean, don't get me wrong, everything you do in the game, aside from the sporting stuff, does make you feel like you're contributing to the overall fight against Eden's Gate, but each region has over 40 missions to complete, 136 in total, 136 missions. Now this included side missions, but still, it's so hard to get sidetracked, especially when nearly all of those missions involve their own quest-giving characters, so it's hard to get attached to the characters as well. Most of the missions in the game are treated like busy work. Fetch quests galore, especially the side missions, which often have you tracking down multiple items and then simply turning them in for a reward at the end. The repetitiveness became abundant when you consider that there's 136 of them. Now granted, they're not all the same, but there are only a select few that stand out as truly being unique and interesting. For the most part, you're just killing bad guys, taking out monuments, infiltrating outposts, and fetching objects and turning them in for a reward. And it all just felt like a grind to the end, instead of feeling compelled to figure out what happens. Going off this point, the main story itself doesn't have much structure. At the very least, it can be messy. The most annoying thing about it is once you reach certain levels of resistance, the game forces you away from whatever it is you were doing to drop you in a cutscene and makes you do another mission. It happens constantly. It's like the writers didn't know how to account for the freedom and choices of the player to go around doing whatever they wanted while still propelling the story, so instead they just force you into a linear narrative and ignore whatever it is you were doing, whether you want to or not. And this brings me to one of my biggest points of contention with the game as a whole. It's like you're constantly being griefed. Since the call has enemies on the roads and stationed at various locations throughout, you might be doing some fishing and all of a sudden you're getting attacked by cultists. Doing some hunting, attacked by cultists. Traveling to a mission you want to do, attacked by cultists. Scaling a mountain, attacked by eagles. I understand it adds realism because you really can be attacked by wild animals, but it just got old after a while. And it became extremely annoying when the cult starts sending planes after you that always seem to be aware of where you are and riddle you with machine gun and rockets.
Leave last night. Cougar! Don't be underestimating!
But going back to the story, Joseph C. just seems like a real wasted opportunity. His introduction is really good. I can't stress it enough. He comes off as a powerful and interesting enemy, but you spend little to no time with him. Almost none, really, between the beginning and the ending, as you're dealing with his lieutenants the whole time. Now, I know the bar was set pretty high with Voss and Pagan, and it looked like initially Seed would fall in line as the next great villain, as he's well voice acted, I'll give him that, but I can't help feeling there's much more to him lying on the cutting room floor. Without spoiling anything about the ending, I'll just say it was kind of a joke the way they handled the climactic boss battle, as it fell into one of gaming's biggest tropes of fighting multiple enemies at once, but with a unique wrinkle. And the game's conclusion leaves a lot to be desired, at least one of the endings, which literally ends with very little resolution. It just felt like the writers failed to explore Seed's psyche and really get down into his motivations. The style and tone of the game is pretty good. The cinematography and sound design is top notch, and there are some really stylistic sequences that I appreciated.
They're coming in from the lake!
But with that said, it can get a little dull, as there isn't much diversity among the three regions, except for Faith's because of the bliss that permeates the air and creates this cool effect in both screen and sound. There's also some side activities you can do, like hunting and fishing, like I alluded to before, with a diverse number of animals and fish you can track and then sell their skins or meat for cash. The Clutch Nixon sections where you navigate courses in either a plane or a four-wheeler like in Evel Knievel, with heavy metal music blasting in the background.
Easy does it.
There's base jumping, but it's just kind of tied in with wingsuits and parachutes. But that's really it. A surprising low amount of activities in an open world of this scale. It also doesn't help that the world map is absolute garbage. Aside from being tedious to move around from one end to the other, there's no way to isolate markers, as you have to be zoomed in all the way to see what everything is, which makes it even more tedious to move around in. It was a nightmare trying to find what I was looking for when I was completing certain challenges and objectives. Now, I talked about tacked on earlier, and nothing feels more tacked on than the multiplayer, called Arcade Mode. There's really only two modes, solo and co-op, which consists of liberating outposts, eliminating a set number of enemies, acting as a bounty hunter, or reaching a specific point on a map where you have to go through enemies. And there's the multiplayer, which is just your standard deathmatch and team deathmatch. Now, while there is a huge variety of maps due to the arcade creator, it's basically the same thing over and over again. It's even more frustrating because the game does a horrible job indicating which players are on your team and which players are your enemies. There have been so many times where I ran up to teammates and shot them only to discover that they were my teammates, and others when I ran right past an enemy and got gunned down instantly. There's also hero mode where you're thrown into a random map and have to take out a bunch of enemies, but overall multiplayer just feels uninspired and kind of shallow. Now, there is co-op, so you can roam Hope County with a friend, although there's no matchmaking, so if you don't have someone to join your session, you're SOL. But it can be fun wreaking havoc on cultists with a buddy. And although the launch was good and reliable, there were a number of technical issues and hilarious glitches. Falling through the world, textures that aren't fully programmed, getting teleported, NPCs with stupid janky animations, objects floating nonsensically, some real weird stuff too. Although I can't say the game never fatally crashed on me, I still couldn't go more than an hour or so without seeing one of these glitches, and this was after 2 patches from Ubisoft. One final thing I want to mention is the microtransactions. There were a lot of controversy about its inclusion and how they would end up allowing the player to essentially speed through the game. Although microtransactions are never accepted by me in a full retail single-player AAA game, I do have to say that I never once felt the need to use them, like at all. I forgot entirely that they were even there. It feels kind of like what I talked about, tacked on, as I don't see much use for them at all. The silver bars you can obtain aren't at all necessary, and you can find them in the game anyway. Even in multiplayer, which I'm horrible at by the way, I don't see how they can help you that much at all. I beat the game just fine without ever feeling starved for them, and I played for several hours with multiplayer without feeling the need for them either. So maybe the idea that this was just included to please the publisher benefited them in a way, because I can attest that you definitely don't need them to enjoy the game. Well, considering all this, I arrived at a final score of 6 out of 10. The game at its core is repetitive, tedious, and grindy, although it does have stunning visuals and some unique features that make it above average. And although I spent over 30 hours doing everything I possibly could, the game just felt like a chore to play, especially at the end, and I ended up suffering through the last sections just to complete it, as I didn't really care anymore. But you can have fun, and if this is the type of game you love, first-person shooters in a vast open world, then you may have a much better experience than I did, and although I can't recommend it blindly to all players, you can easily be entertained for hours like I was. But just maybe wait until the price drops. Well, let me know in the comments what you thought of Far Cry 5, and what you thought about this video. And as always, thanks for watching.
I am your father. And you are my child.